Okay, thank you so much. So I will be speaking on adaptation research and policy progress in Africa, so that we can draw and see a couple of insights from the work of Irene. As a way of introduction, I think it is important just to note that the climate change impacts are projected to increase in Africa, and this is actually not new. Report after report on projections show that the impacts will actually be more. Why? Because obviously of the low adaptive capacity that a number of African countries have, the high sensitivity to climate change in a continent where the majority of people depend on natural resources-based livelihood strategies, which are very sensitive to climate extremes, and then the high vulnerability. Now, within this context, you realize that with the low adaptive capacity, high sensitivity, and high vulnerability, the coming in or the kicking in of the COVID-19 has actually worsened the situation. So adaptation was now examined in Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa, just to see lessons that we can learn on how we ought to respond to this. Now, in terms of the methodology that was used, we had all these convenings with over 3,000 people participating in over 30 convenings. Now, what are some of the key insights that we get on adaptation from the Southern and Western Africa? So what we did was that we had a convening for East Africa and then the Southern and Western Africa. I must be quick to mention that we did not have a convening for North Africa, but this is something that we need to look at as we move forward. Now, one of the key things that came out is that there is an increasing push for contextualized adaptation research, planning, action, and finance in addressing the impacts of climate change. So the policymakers, the practitioners, one of the things that they are saying is that we need to actually contextualize adaptation research planning so that this responds to various challenges within specific contexts. The other thing that also came out prominently was that there's need for transformative adaptation research, and this transformative adaptation research needs to look at shifting of power relations. It also needs to look at knowledge structures and learning systems. Now, these are important so as to accelerate the impact for the most vulnerable communities. Now, the need for this transformative adaptation research is simply because embedded within the vulnerability, embedded within the sensitivity of people to climate change are power relations, which often are neglected in strategies that are developed to reduce our vulnerability. So there is need for transformative research that addresses power relations, the knowledge structures, as well as the learning systems. Further, there is also need for multi-level partnerships for transformative adaptation research. Now, these are needed to steer forward adaptation as the highest priority. Now, within Africa, adaptation obviously is very critical. And as we look at adaptation and mitigation, we tend to lean more towards adaptation. Now, for us to adapt to climate change, there's need for these multi-level partnerships that will help us steer this forward. Then the other thing that came out is that there's need for the generation of robust evidence on best adaptation practices for Southern and Western African region. Now, what this simply means is that there's need for robust evidence so that adaptation is actually based on evidence. Dr. Taylor did allude to this in his introductory remarks, that there are a couple of times when adaptation actions are just lifted from one area to another. But we need to ensure that we have robust evidence so that our adaptation is based on evidence. Now, when you look at this evidence, it's not at the regional level. We need evidence at national level and even at sub-national levels. Now, this is actually a prerogative of stakeholders who are within the region, simply because they are the ones that understand the various challenges that they face and therefore need to be key in finding solutions to those challenges. Going now to the convening that we had in East Africa, what are some of the key insights that came out? One of the things that came out is the fact that there's need to establish a regionally led adaptation learning framework that could fast track the realization of evidence-based learning. So there is need to have this regional important framework that will help us fast track realization of this evidence-based learning. There is also need to develop robust regional data management for better access and utilization by climate change stakeholders. So we need to have a database. One of the challenges that you'll find not only in East Africa, this is also the case for Southern Africa, is that we seem not to have a good database at national level, even at sub-national levels. Now, a good database is important because it is actually the starting point for good adaptation measures that can be developed. There is need for a regionally led adaptation tracking and indicator framework, which then will capture the impacts and lessons, so that, because these are needed to facilitate appropriate climate finance and technology deployment. So we need to actually have indicators and then be in a position to actually track these indicators. The other thing also that came out prominently is the need for community adaptation innovations. Now, these have actually emerged in the region, including nature-based solutions. So we need to actually look at this community adaptation innovation so that we can build on that. Now, if you look at this point, this actually strengthens the fact that good adaptation should be done by stakeholders within specific regions. Researchers, policymakers, and climate change stakeholders need to actually strengthen this locally led community adaptation innovations systems that not only will scale up, but also leverage innovation platform from other regions. So what you're saying is that apart from these community-based adaptation innovations, these must be informed or supported by researchers, policymakers, and other stakeholders so that this is actually strengthened. In East Africa, the linkages between science and policy are still not yet robust, and there's actually need for this to be strengthened. So this came out very strongly among the various stakeholders, and it was good that in our convenings we had policymakers, we had researchers, and people coming from different backgrounds. So this came out very strongly. The delegates therefore called for the adoption of innovative research options, and these innovative research options should include the use of space technology to maybe map and analyze complex ecosystems. For example, if you look at an ecosystem like Victoria, which is quite complex, looking at various systems, not only like Victoria, but we also have a couple of others within the Southern African region that will require a complex approach. So there's need for technology that will use this space, that will use space. And then this will be critical to support transformative solutions. Now, in terms of my conclusion, looking at the engagements that we had in Southern Africa and West Africa, as well as the engagement in East Africa, what are some of the key lessons? One of the things that is coming out very strongly is the need for adaptation learning framework, to have an adaptation learning framework, and this framework needs to actually have even indicators developed. Now, once this is done, then this will be helpful in tracking progress. In the absence of a framework, this will be a bit of a challenge. It will actually be a very big challenge. The other thing that also came out is that there's actually increasing recognition of nature-based solution and or ecosystem-based adaptation. This is actually growing in recognition, and again, this needs to actually have good indicators developed so that we can have this learning framework under which we can understand it. There's also the need for more investment in research focus on interactions between like the new and old land use systems, and also appreciating their roles in adaptation in the face of this unprecedented climate variability and change in the region. So it is therefore clear from our engagement with various stakeholders that there is a need to actually, there's need to adapt, but for us to have meaningful adaptation to the various risks that surround us, there is need to actually develop appropriate adaptation measures, and this must be done within a good framework with indicators developed And this must also bring to the fore community-led innovation. With that, I'll end my presentation, and thank you so much.